After my one-day break, for which, by the way, thanks to everybody who watches these programs for your kind words and understanding. Anyway, after my one-day break, I come back to my programs, and as I have discussed many times, one goes on a break, one expects that events will take place whilst one is away from doing one's programs, but one discounts the possibility that anything earth-shaking will happen, and something earth-shaking duly takes place. And, of course, I am referring now to the assassination attempt on Donald Trump. Now, I say assassination attempt, one of the most astonishing and depressing facts about that attack is that in the hours that followed, I read several articles in a number of places, especially, it must be said, the British media, which referred to the assassination attempt as an alleged assassination attempt, implying or insinuating that which all of us could see in the film that of the attempt that took place, well, that all of it was somehow unreal, or perhaps had not been fully corroborated, or that it might be less than it seemed. Something which I have to say I found absolutely ridiculous to the point of absurdity, but which is very consistent with what I think we've all come to expect from the way in which the media nowadays handles any story relating to Donald Trump. But anyway, there was undoubtedly an assassination attempt. It took place during a rally that Donald Trump attended. He attends many rallies, unlike his opponent, Joe Biden. He's somebody who moves from rally to a rally. He likes to speak and to communicate directly to his supporters. It is very much a way that he conducts his campaign. And anyway, during that rally, an attempt to assassinate him was made. Now, one of the things that I am going to say straight away about this particular assassination attempt is that I and many others have expected that an assassination attempt on Donald Trump, a serious assassination attempt on Donald Trump, would take place over the course of this presidential campaign. Now, in saying this, I've been extremely careful not to make that claim openly in programs on this channel, but I've discussed it frequently with Alex Christoforou, my colleague and friend, in informal discussions. We've discussed it also, each of us, with other people, including some of the people you see who come on as guests of the Duran. And, of course, we've both hinted at this possibility in our programs. We both hinted at the possibility that as the presidential campaign proceeded, especially if it became clear that the various attempts to derail Donald Trump's campaign, which have been made, for example, the various legal cases that were brought against him and the various stories that have been circulated about him, if those didn't work, if it turned out that he was, in fact, gaining strength over the course of the campaign, if it began to appear that he might actually win re-election in November, I say re-election because, of course, he has been president before, well, it seemed as if there was at least a possibility that an attempt to remove him from contention by murdering him would take place. And of course, This is something which has happened in the United States before. We've had assassinations. The very earliest political event I can remember, the very first one that impinged on my understanding as a small child in Greece in the 1960s, was the assassination of Robert Kennedy Sr. In 1968, during the election of 1968. There'd been a military coup in Greece the year before. Many people in Greece had been linking their hopes to the end of the military dictatorship, which had been established as a result of that coup on Robert Kennedy's election. And I remember, and it impressed me then, what alarmed despondency the news of Robert Kennedy's assassination had caused amongst the people of Greece, at least the people who I was in contact with as a small child at that time. So, political assassination is not, unfortunately or tragically, such a rare thing in the United States. And I was sure that if it did look as if Donald Trump had a strong prospect of being re-elected in November, despite, as I said, all the obstacles that have been put in his way, an attempt to remove him violently would take place. Now, in saying that, I want to make it absolutely clear that I am not pointing fingers specifically at any particular person or group of people. I was not suggesting that there is some kind of intrigue or plot at the highest level to remove Donald Trump. I have no information to that effect. But what I will say is this: over the last years, in fact, ever since he burst into US politics 9 years ago, when he came down that escalator in Trump Tower and announced that he was a candidate for the presidency in the 2016 election, the way in which everything connected to Donald Trump has been steadily amplified. The chorus of alarm and dismay and concern about him, the overheated, passionate, vociferous rhetoric that has floated around about him, has made it seemed to me, inevitable that if he really was likely to be re-elected President of the United States, someone somewhere would take the possibility that the future of the United States, that the future of democracy in the United States was genuinely at risk, and would decide that the only way to save the United States and democracy would be by finding some means to remove Donald Trump from the political scene. And, well, it's the same dynamic that we saw at work a few weeks ago in Slovakia with the attempted assassination of the current Slovak Prime Minister, Robert Fico, who has also been the target of a very similar campaign in Slovakia. In fact, Robert Fico, over the last few hours, has made himself drawn himself attention to the parallels between the overheated atmosphere in Slovakia and the overheated atmosphere around Donald Trump in the United States. And, well, briefly, I think that Robert Fico is right. And just a few hours before news of the assassination attempt on Donald Trump came through, I read an extraordinary editorial in the Guardian newspaper. I say the Guardian, but actually it was not in the Guardian as such. Rather, it was in the Observer, which is of course the Sunday edition, if you like, of the Guardian, and it was in theory about the importance of the need for Joe Biden to stand down, and it made comments about Donald Trump like this. Biden says Trump poses an existential threat to US democracy, and he's right. Trump tried to overthrow the 2020 election results. He attempted to nobble electoral officials. He says he will act as a dictator on day one in office, has warned of a bloodbath if he loses again, and is vowing revenge on judges, prosecutors, and others he dislikes. Trump is a convicted felon, sexual abuser, and fraudster. By the way, he is not yet a convicted felon. He will only become that if Judge Merchan, in the case in New York, actually sentenced him, which he hasn't yet done. But anyway, that's just a detail. Moving on, The Guardian, this was, as I said, in just the hours before the assassination attempt, went on to say Trump believes he is above the law. For Britain and other allies, the thought of a second Trump term is troubling. Keir Starmer's new Labour government can expect nothing but political and ideological hostility from this ultra-nationalist, xenophobic hawk. And we then go on to read, and then there's Ukraine. Trump, a keen admirer of Vladimir Putin and dictators generally, claims he could end the war overnight. What he actually means is that he would put pressure on Kiev to accept permanent loss of territory to Russia in return for peace. It would be the greatest of betrayals. It would set a terrible precedent for Taiwan and similar disputes, and it could trigger the collapse of NATO. US credibility would be shot. And then we go on to read about how Trump is plainly irresponsible, and somewhere in this editorial I seem to remember that Trump is actually described as a tyrant or as a would-be tyrant. So there you have it. All that kind of rhetoric, that's in The Guardian, but of course The Guardian is widely read in the United States, and that kind of rhetoric has been circulating and floating around the United States now, ebbing and flowing for 9 years, but it has been growing in volume, especially over the last few months, and especially perhaps over the last few weeks, ever since the television debate that took place just under 3 weeks ago, in which, by every admission, Joe Biden, the president, basically imploded over the course of the debate, making it seem much more likely that Donald Trump would gain election. So, in light of all of this, overheated rhetoric, it's not just myself and Alex Christoforou and the people we have been speaking to, but many, many other people as well, sometimes making that point in open comments, in open observations. You can find them all over the internet. If you search widely enough, lots of people have been extremely worried, very, very concerned that the possibility of an assassination attempt on Donald Trump existed, that someone, somewhere in the United States would take all this rhetoric seriously, would be motivated by this rhetoric to save democracy, the Republic, Ukraine, NATO, freedom around the world, or whatever, into their hands, and would decide, as unstable and violent and troubled people do. And by the way, on that point, as I've said before in various programs, in my previous line of work, I had the experience of meeting and interviewing and trying to assist all kinds of violent and unstable and troubled people, and I know a little about what motivates them and what can provoke them to act. Anyway, there was many people who were concerned that someone like that would be induced or provoked or inspired to do what was attempted over the course of the weekend, over the course of yesterday, and would try indeed to murder Donald Trump. So this was a completely predictable event, one that was very, very widely predicted. And the most astonishing, the most troubling, the most disturbing thing about it, the thing that I am completely unable, even now, fully to absorb or understand, is the complete failure of the Secret Service to protect Donald Trump, to ensure that Donald Trump received the kind of protection that he was entitled to as a candidate for the US presidency. Now, I am not obviously an expert in bodyguard techniques, but even I can see that things went seriously wrong. Apparently, this armed man who shot at President Trump and who was apparently in a position to shoot at not just President Trump, but at various other people as well, with an AR-15 rifle, killing at least one other person. Anyway, this person managed to get within, I believe, 150 meters of Donald Trump, in other words, within clear view of Donald Trump. He was able to climb onto a building. He was seen by various people doing so, who noticed that he was armed. Apparently, several people tried to warn the authorities, the police and the Secret Service, that he was there. There's even a picture which appears to show, I stress appears to show because I'm not sure that this is correct, but I might be misunderstanding the pictures, but there's a picture which appears to show a Secret Service sniper keeping track of the movements of this person. And yet, in spite of all of that, apparently nothing was done to try to interfere with this person taking position, putting himself in a position where he could launch fire on Donald Trump, shoot at Donald Trump, with a strong possibility, indeed probability, assuming that he had a modicum of skill in using firearms, a probability that he would be able to kill Donald Trump from the vantage that he had reached. And in fact, when I say a probability, I've read many reports now. I've also received some from various people who are familiar with the use of firearms, which, by the way, I am not, but several of them have commented to me in private emails, pointing out how well positioned this person was to actually successfully carry out the assassination. It seems that at least one bullet, the bullet that injured Donald Trump, that pierced his ear, probably aimed for his forehead. It's been suggested that he the shooter either misjudged the effect of the wind, or perhaps was sidetracked by the fact that Donald Trump moved his head, turned his head at the moment that the bullet whizzed past him or whizzed towards him. There's suggestions. Perhaps one of the more plausible suggestions that I've read is that the shooter, who apparently was young, allegedly 20 years old, might not have been particularly experienced in the use of firearms, though of course 20-year-old men can serve in the military, can work with firearms. So youth in itself is not a reason to expect inexperience. But anyway, putting that aside, this young man might perhaps have been nervous, might have overcompensated in some way as he was shooting this weapon. I'm no sort of shooter myself. I'm not going to try and guess about that. But suffice to say that a better trained sniper, a calmer, more collected sniper, almost certainly shooting towards Donald Trump from the position this person had reached, would almost certainly have succeeded in killing Donald Trump. And as it was, as Donald Trump himself is saying, it is almost a miracle. It is a miracle that this person missed and that he is still alive. And I am incredulous that such a thing could have happened. Now, again, let me stress, I'm not an expert in bodyguard matters. I've never had a bodyguard, or worked as a bodyguard, or had much contact with people who are. But I would have assumed that one of the basic things that bodyguards do, especially if they're the Secret Service with all the resources that the Secret Service have, is make sure that all the major positions are covered, make sure that places, high buildings nearby or higher buildings nearby are controlled, that they would make absolutely sure that a gunman would not get into the position that this person did. And, well, that's my inexpert view. But all sorts of experts have come forward and have commented about this. And they have said much more than I am competent to say. And their general verdict has been excoriating. Now, Brian Beletic at the New Atlas has done a brilliant video discussing all of this. He is, unlike myself, obviously trained in the use of firearms. He is a former Marine, and he's described in detail the absolutely astonishing lapses that the Secret Service showed in their failure to protect Donald Trump. But if you don't want to follow Brian Beletic, well, go to Eric Prince, who has written an absolutely excoriating discussion of the bizarre, grotesque lapses of the Secret Service in their attempts to protect and guard Donald Trump. So, the most predictable assassination attempt in American history, perhaps, and the Secret Service caught unprepared and bungling their attempts to protect this candidate for the presidency, who it was all but certain would be the target of an assassination attempt of precisely this kind. Now, I am at a complete loss to explain this. Of course, there are many people who are saying that all of these lapses, all of these failures point to some kind of intention, that there was more than just negligence here, that there was some kind of decision made to provide inadequate protection for Donald Trump. I still reel at the implication of this. But if you discount that, if you think that it was a failure, negligence, if you like, then the degree of negligence on the part of the Secret Service seems to me to have been incredible, all but incredible. And for myself, I have to say that this is now becoming part of a pattern. I have been one of these people who, looking at the United States from a distance over the last decade and a half, has been shocked by the repeated failures of institutions that I once believed in. The FBI conducting investigations that seem to me absurd and ridiculous into Donald Trump's supposed connections with the Russians, and doing so over years until finally they had to admit that there was no evidence for those connections, something which to me was obvious from the start. The court system of the United States delivering judgments which I found bizarre, and doing so, by the way, over several years, not just recently in the recent cases that have been brought against Donald Trump. The US military, unable to construct a pier that works in Gaza. Well, case after case of this, and now it looks as if the Secret Service as well, and another one of those institutions in whose competence I absolutely believed. Well, it's now clear that my belief in it has no basis in fact. Now, of course, many people, Americans who are watching this program, will shake their heads in disbelief at my naivety, assuming that these institutions that I had believed in, these American institutions that I had believed in their basic competence and integrity, I mean, they will snort with derision at my naivety about this. But nonetheless, I remain incredulous myself and disbelieving at the extent of their failure. It seems that with every single twist and turn of Donald Trump's extraordinary career, with every twist and turn of the decisions of the US government and officials, the failures in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Libya, the failures on so many other fronts, going all the way back, the failure to deal with Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, the failure to provide basic protection to Epstein in his prison. All my assumptions about American efficiency, American competence on the part of US agencies, they repeatedly go up in smoke. I was once brought up to believe, and genuinely did believe, that whatever criticisms you might make of the United States, the US knew, people in the US knew how to get things done. Well, increasingly, it turns out otherwise. The Secret Service was just about the one institution that I still believed knew how to do its job. It turns out, but about the US Secret Service, even about that, I was wrong. So there we are, a disaster, and I'm not even exploring in this program the other more nefarious possibilities that many, many people are talking about over the internet. I'm not going to look for plots before evidence for them exists. That doesn't mean, of course, that plots have not happened, but there it is. Anyway, let's move on and look at the political implications of this. I've said that over the last 3 weeks, President Biden's campaign has imploded. The way in which the president conducted himself over the course of his television debate with Donald Trump was an absolute disaster. I've also said that the president's attempts to revive his authority with press conferences and interviews have been disastrous as well. I thought that the president's latest attempt, his address to the American people following the attempted assassination of Donald Trump, was equally unconvincing. Moreover, I would add that it struck me that the president gave a strong impression of feeling weirdly passionless about the event that had just happened. That, it seemed, even as he said that it was something that was unacceptable and wrong, he seemed to feel a little anger about it. Just saying. Anyway, I've said that even as the president's own campaign has imploded, even as it's become increasingly clear to most people, many people, that he's hardly in a position to conduct the affairs of the United States effectively, manage his government properly. Well, even as all that has happened, Donald Trump himself, over the last couple of hours, has behaved with astonishing resilience and bravery. Firstly, he acted with incredible bravery during the moments after the assassination attempt on himself, even as the Secret Service agents around him tried to protect him. And by the way, I wasn't impressed by the way they were doing that either. Anyway, he pushed them aside. He made himself visible to his supporters. He raised his fist into the air. He spoke about fighting on. And of course, all of this was captured in film. And there's now what I have no doubt will become an iconic photograph of him doing so, with the American flag, the stars and stripes fluttering just behind him. I've already seen comparisons being made with that incredibly famous photograph of the Marines, the US Marines, raising the flag in Iwo Jima, over Iwo Jima during the Second World War. And this picture, this picture of Donald Trump behaving in this way, the important thing to say about it is that it is true. It was absolutely not staged. This is exactly what Donald Trump did at that time. There's been some attempts by Donald Trump's detractors in the media to play down the courage and presence of mind that he showed in the immediate aftermath of this attempt at his life. But the reality is that is exactly what he did. And that type of courage, that type of presence of mind that he showed, a courage that was, by the way, as much moral as physical, that I can say, as a Greek person, is exactly the courage that Greeks referred to when they used the word heroism to describe the way a hero acts. Now, I say that there's a lot of attempts to redefine what the word heroism means, but taken from me as a Greek, what happened on that platform with Donald Trump immediately after the assassination attempt, that actually is precisely what Greeks mean by heroism, and what Greeks have always meant when they use the word heroism, going all the way back to Homer and the Iliad and the conduct of the heroes during the Trojan War. So he did that. Donald Trump did that, but he went on to do more. He issued a series of powerful statements. He made a statement to the American people. He's given interviews to the media. He's rejected all suggestions that he change his itinerary. He's going to Milwaukee to attend the Republican convention. He's been seen. He has made himself visible, being seen, going to the convention, coming off the plane that's taking him to the convention. Many people have made all kinds of observations about Donald Trump. But it's impossible to deny the man's courage after this event, his ability to rise to these events, and of his incredible emotional resilience. Most people subjected to an attack of this kind would feel shock, would feel the need to take a step back, to recover from the shock that they feel. Not, it seems, Donald Trump. The closest approximation that I can come up to in discussing this event is the response of the former French president Charles de Gaulle to an assassination attempt on himself in the early 1960s by the OAS, the group of French military officers, former French military officers, who rebelled against de Gaulle's decision to withdraw from Algeria and who waged a campaign afterwards trying first to overthrow and then to assassinate de Gaulle. They managed at one point to intercept de Gaulle's motorcade and to open fire on it. And de Gaulle was came very close over the course of that attack to being assassinated. Indeed, there's stories that one of the bullets just passed just in front of his face as his car was moving forward. But de Gaulle again showed incredible courage and presence of mind, and went and addressed the French people almost immediately. And, well, the effect politically was that it massively reinforced de Gaulle's position as leader of France, consolidated his position as leader of France, and de Gaulle, by the way, managed to put that fact to good use in the months that followed. Whether Donald Trump will be able to do the same remains to be seen. But I'm going to make one observation now. Whether or not, as many are saying, what has happened has secured Donald Trump's victory in the forthcoming election, well, that election is still 5 months away and a great deal will happen. But around the world, governments, friendly and hostile to the United States, will be drawing their own conclusions. I spoke a couple of days ago in one of my programs about how the implosion of Joe Biden following the television debate, how the criticism of him by Democrats, senior Democrats, and by Democratic Party donors would be certain to have an effect, how many governments around the world, friendly and hostile to the United States, would observe these events, would conclude that there is now a power vacuum in the United States, that Joe Biden himself is no longer in proper control of the United States and of the US government, that there is uncertainty, in fact, about who actually is leading the United States at this time, and that most governments around the world, having reached that conclusion, would start to adjust their policies to take that fact into account. Some of them would be concerned, including some of the governments that are hostile to the United States would be concerned because they would be worried that without a president fully in charge, American policy would become increasingly unpredictable. Some governments, however, would sense an opportunity and might start taking action in the belief that without the president being in full control of the US government, with every sign that the US is working now on autopilot, that this was their opportunity to do things which they might not otherwise have done. Well, governments around the world are going to be assessing the events following this assassination attempt. They will be saying to themselves that there continues to be that power struggle, that power vacuum rather, at the heart of the United States. That President Biden is not in full control of the United States government. They will be seeing the strength of character which Donald Trump has exhibited in the face of this assassination attempt. They will be saying to themselves that it is Donald Trump who is showing leadership at this particular moment. And they will be assuming, they will be calculating that Donald Trump is now likely to be the next president of the United States. And they will again be adjusting their policies accordingly. More and more of these governments, moreover, are going to be reaching out to Donald Trump over the next few weeks and months, contacting members of his team, trying to work out what his policies are going to be once he becomes president, as they now firmly expect. And inevitably, this will also begin to have an effect on the United States itself, on the way in which the United States conducts its foreign policy. The current administration will sense that authority, international authority, is slipping away, and, well, we will see how it responds. Anyway, these were momentous events. We will see how they play out. I don't think they mean that the election necessarily is in the bag for Donald Trump, but I will say that as of the moment of making this program, most of the world is now going to assume that he will indeed become the next president of the United States, and that the days of the current presidency are running out. Well, there it is. One of the governments, two of the governments perhaps, I should say, which are going to be making decisions, important decisions, over the next couple of months, assessing these events very closely, are the Russian and Chinese governments, the two governments which are in the strongest adversarial position towards the United States. In Russia, President Putin's spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, has said that the Russians had to a great extent anticipated that an attack of this kind on Donald Trump would take place. And, well, it's not surprising that they would assume that. And I'm sure that that is true, by the way. And by a bizarre coincidence, shortly before the assassination, the news of the assassination on Donald Trump circulated, echoed around the world, the chief of military intelligence of Ukraine, Kirill Budanov, made an absolutely astonishing admission. He came out and confirmed that Ukraine has made several attempts to assassinate Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, an astonishing fact in itself. Budanov admitted that these assassination attempts had so far been unsuccessful. Well, that's obvious, of course. Again, this admission has not received anything like the publicity or attention that it merits. I think people need to take a step back and think what exactly is being alleged, or at least admitted to here, by the head of Ukraine's own military intelligence. There's been lots of stories, many stories and claims that President Putin and his government have been seeking the assassination of the Ukrainian leader, President Zelensky. I have seen no evidence that this is the case. President Putin apparently assured Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett back in March 2022, at a time when the Russians were negotiating with the Ukrainians using Prime Minister Bennett's good offices as a mediator. Anyway, Putin assured Naftali Bennett that the Russians were not, in fact, seeking the assassination of President Zelensky. And in fact, as I've discussed in previous programs, there have been many occasions when the Russians could have assassinated Zelensky had they been minded to do so. There was one instance when President Zelensky's motorcade was under surveillance by a Russian drone whilst Zelensky was visiting Odessa, and had the Russians wanted to assassinate him, well, they could have done that then, and of course they didn't do so. But of course the story of Putin's vengeful plan to have Zelensky killed, to decapitate the Ukrainian leadership, is one which continues to circulate and is revived from time to time. But here we have the chief of Ukrainian military intelligence. He's coming out just before, as I said, an assassination attempt on Donald Trump. And he's admitting that the Ukrainians have several times attempted to assassinate Vladimir Putin, the president, let us remember, of a nuclear superpower, the country with the most powerful nuclear arsenal on planet Earth. And, well, needless to say, attempts to murder the leader of another country are absolutely an act of war. Had the Ukrainian attempts been successful, no one can say how the Russian government might have responded, but it would have been fully justified in that case, legally speaking, to declare war on Ukraine, actually move towards outright war with Ukraine, at which point, of course, given that Russia is a nuclear superpower, anybody can guess what might have happened. I ought to add that if at any point in the future there is an assassination attempt on Putin, well, based on what Budanov has said, we can all assume that it is indeed the Ukrainians who are behind it. I'm going to, by the way, mention one instance when I think, based on what Budanov has just now admitted to, we can say with confidence that the Ukrainians did indeed attempt to assassinate Putin. Way back last year, I remember that there was a drone attack, an attack by Ukrainian drones on the Kremlin, including what looked to me at the time to be an attempt to attack President Putin's office. The drone attack was a failure, and as it turns out, Putin was not in his office at the time when the Ukrainian drones impacted, doing, as it happens, only superficial damage, and apparently they were anyway being jammed at the time by the Russians. But I remember saying at the time that that looked to me like an assassination attempt on Putin, and well, here we are, and it seems to me that Budanov has just admitted as much. But anyway, there we are. The Russians expected an assassination attempt on Trump. They've now been told that the Ukrainians have attempted an assassination attempt, or at least Budanov implied made more than one attempt to assassinate their own leader. And the very first thing that the Russians have done in response is that they've announced enhanced protection for their own leader, for President Putin, in response to potential attacks upon him. So there we go. That's one thing that the Russians have done. But, of course, they're going to do an awful lot more if, as is likely, they now assume or think that there's now a high chance that President Trump will be elected president in November. They're going to be observing what Trump is saying about the conflict in Ukraine very closely. They will probably try to find out from intermediaries like Prime Minister Viktor Orban, who has actually just met Trump, what Trump's thoughts about ending the conflict in Ukraine actually are. The Russians have admitted that though they are aware that Trump has spoken about a plan to end the conflict in Ukraine, they have no clue what that plan is. And I would expect that the Russians, one way or the other, are going to try to reach out to Trump to find out what his actual ideas are, not just about Ukraine, but about the whole range of issues that affect Russia's relationship with the United States. And of course, the Chinese government, which has its own history with Donald Trump, it's a widely overlooked fact that Xi Jinping and Donald Trump, at a personal level, actually got on quite well with each other. They're going to try and find out what Trump is actually thinking about relations with China, whether he really does want to escalate the situation over Taiwan, for example. And the Chinese, as I said, will also be trying to reach out in some form to Donald Trump over the next few weeks, and other governments will too. Israel, whose Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, is shortly on the 24th of July, be addressing the two houses of Congress. Highly likely that Prime Minister Netanyahu will want to meet with Donald Trump. The Saudis, who had a very good relationship with Donald Trump, the same thing. They too will no doubt want to speak with Donald Trump. All kinds of important governments around the world are going to be reaching out to Donald Trump over the next few weeks. And the current administration very unhappy about it. But there it is. One other government will no doubt be wanting to do the same, and that, of course, is the government of Ukraine. The Ukrainians are known to be deeply worried about the fact that Donald Trump has shown, shall we say, a lack of enthusiasm for Project Ukraine, for the unstinting support that Ukraine has basically received from the Biden administration. And by the way, on that, we've had a number of comments from the Ukrainians about their latest interactions with the Biden administration. It seems that Zelensky and Yermak were deeply disappointed, according to Politico, with their meeting with Biden in Washington at the time of the NATO summit meeting. They were looking for more public displays of support from the United States than they received. They were hoping that Biden would confirm that they do have permission to launch missile strikes deep inside Russia. They were deeply upset and disappointed when it turned out that Biden, on this occasion, held the line and was not prepared to agree to deep strikes against Russia. He said that the topic needed further discussion, and the Ukrainians came away deeply disappointed with that result. Ukrainians have been grumbling ever since the Washington summit, by the way, that they're not receiving anything like the kind of help that they needed, and they will be very concerned. They'll be worried that even as the Biden administration is disappointing them, a Trump administration that might come might be far less supportive and sympathetic of Ukraine. And of course, the Europeans are going to be alarmed as well. They have a very difficult relationship with Donald Trump. They doubt the degree of his commitment. I suspect not so much to NATO itself, but to the set of policies that NATO has been following. They must be very worried that they will be left high and dry over Ukraine, that the Americans and the Russians might come together and agree to something without the Europeans being involved. And all of those concerns, all of those worries are going to now intensify. Over the course of the recent NATO summit meeting, reports started to circulate. I've discussed them in a previous program, that people close to Donald Trump have been warning the Europeans that once Trump is elected, he will start to reduce, downscale the level of intelligence cooperation between the United States and some of the European states. And I've explained that part of the explanation for that is some of the things that happened in the first months of Donald Trump's presidency, when some European governments, some European intelligence agencies provided information to the United States intelligence community, which were used in the investigations of Donald Trump and of his associates, which took place at that time, and which caused Donald Trump enormous political embarrassment, though in the end it turned out that the allegations that were circulating about him were completely untrue. But anyway, that would have been already for the Europeans an unsettling warning, and the prospect of Donald Trump now being elected, the alarm will grow. And we have a telltale sign of the panic that is starting to take hold in Europe. Not so much about the assassination attempt. After the assassination attempt, which took place after the decision I'm going to discuss must have been made, but about the contacts between Donald Trump and Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary. Now, Orban, as I've discussed in recent programs, as President of the European Council, has been trying to conduct diplomacy to find some means of ending the conflict in Ukraine, finding some kind of negotiated outcome to the conflict in Ukraine. And he's visited all the relevant capitals. He's been to Kiev, he's been to Moscow, he's been to Beijing, he's been to the United States, and perhaps most important of all, whilst in the United States, he had a meeting with Donald Trump. And Orban, as President of the European Council, or rather as President of the European Union in effect, intended to convene an informal meeting of EU foreign ministers in August to discuss all of these various meetings that he's had, all of the various exchanges he's had with all of these important governments, and of course with Donald Trump himself. And the Europeans are furious about this. They don't want to hear what Viktor Orban is going to say. They don't want to do anything that might in any way suggest that they endorse his diplomatic initiatives. So rather than allow an informal meeting to take place in Budapest so that Orban and his foreign minister can brief them properly about his diplomatic contacts, apparently Charles Michel, the President of the European Council, is convening a meeting of the European Council to coincide with this foreign ministers' meeting that Orban was trying to put together. And the idea was that all of the foreign ministers, all of the officials would have to attend this meeting in Brussels rather than Orban's meeting in Budapest, making it impossible, in effect, for this meeting in Budapest to take place. Now, the childish, petulant nature of this move is beyond belief. It is unworthy of statesmen who purport to lead countries, and in the case of Charles Michel, who are senior officials of the European Union. But put that aside, it's a symptom of panic. It's a symptom of the panic that the Europeans feel, that they've taken an extreme position over Ukraine, a maximalist position over Ukraine, supporting the Zelensky government's maximalist objectives in the war. And here they have one of their own, Viktor Orban, taking steps to, as they see it, undercut what they're doing and meeting with two of the people that the Europeans consider to be persona non grata to an extreme degree, one of course being Putin and the other being Trump, undermining, or so the Europeans think, what the Europeans are trying to do. So it demonstrates, as I said, the level of panic and anger that the Europeans feel. And of course, after the events consequent on this assassination attempt, that level of panic is going to grow. It is going to get much, much worse as they sense that President Biden is not up to defeating Donald Trump, that Donald Trump now looks like an unstoppable force, that he's moving towards being re-elected as president, and that he looks like he's ready to break with the Europeans, not just on various other NATO policies, but first and foremost over Project Ukraine. Now, if the Europeans are sensible, they will shift their policies. They will understand that President Trump is once again the future, or so it looks. They will try to establish contact with him. They will try to work out what his intentions are, and they will adjust their own plans accordingly. I doubt that they will do that. I think much more likely they will try to speak to Donald Trump and try to persuade him to change course, which unlikely perhaps that he will do. Why would he follow the line the Europeans have taken, given the fact that the Europeans have shown repeatedly their extreme hostility towards him? And of course, if Donald Trump does do what many people expect, which is nominate J.D. Vance as his vice president, J.D. Vance is even more persona non grata amongst the Europeans than is Trump himself. Well, the Europeans will be angrier and more alarmed still. But even then, I still don't expect them seriously to change their policies. More likely, they will redouble their efforts over the next few months to, as they put it, Trump-proof Project Ukraine. Though I'm going to suggest that realistically, that is impossible. Project Ukraine cannot succeed without the full backing of the United States. So I'm not saying that this assassination attempt changes everything, but it changes a great deal. Not so much the assassination attempt itself, not so much the fact that it came so close to success, but Donald Trump's response to it, his display of leadership at precisely that moment, when the leadership provided by the current president, Joe Biden, is in so much doubt. Well, that brings me back now to the main topic of these programs, which is the actual conflict in Ukraine. Because one of the things that makes this whole situation so absurd is that, of course, Orban, and one assumes Trump and J.D. Vance, in looking to try and find a negotiated end to the war, are absolutely right, because the Ukrainians continue to be smashed. Now, I'm going to do a relatively brief summary now of what's going on in the war, but a summary always needs to be made because, of course, it is the war that is driving events. So first and foremost, it is now clear that the Russians have indeed managed to stabilize their bridgehead south of the Volga River. They've crossed from northern Volchansk into southern Volchansk. They're now enlarging the area of territory that they control in southern Volchansk. They've also pushing the Ukrainians out of the positions that the Ukrainians previously occupied in eastern Volchansk, north of the Volga River. The Ukrainians appear to have launched some kind of a desperate counterattack in northern Volchansk. They've sent some troops across the Volga River themselves. This is clearly an attempt to try to throw the Russians off balance, even as the Russians enlarge their territory of control in Volchansk, north and south of the Volga River. All this counterattack will do is that it will sacrifice many more Ukrainian men and soldiers in a pointless counterattack. And it's now increasingly looking as if the battle for Volchansk has taken a decisive turn, and that the ultimate capture of Volchansk by the Russians has now become inevitable. And the Russians, by the way, have been using Fab 3000 bombs extensively around Volchansk. And they, by the way, now published pictures of these Fab 3000 glided bombs being attached to Sukhoi 34 fighter bombers. We can see them in action, and it's an interesting film, suffice to say. But anyway, the battle in Kharkiv region, in the northern part of Kharkiv region, is going decisively in Russia's favor. And the same is true of the battle in southern Kharkiv region, in the area near Kupiansk. I spoke in my previous program about how the Russians had apparently captured half of the village, the southern half of the village of Makeyevka. The latest reports do suggest that they've captured the northern part of this village as well. There is apparently part of the village of Makeyevka located on the west bank of the Zherebets River. That is still under Ukrainian control. The Russians are not yet in a position to cross the Zherebets River, but they've captured the whole of Makeyevka on the east bank of the Zherebets River. That puts the Russians in a strong position to advance north towards Kupiansk itself and south towards Terny and all of these other places. One way or the other, it looks as if Ukrainian positions in the Zherebets River area are now in the process of collapsing. The Zherebets River and the Oskol River, the Russians have broken through all of the Ukrainian defenses. It looks as if within a few weeks, the Russians will be in full control of the east banks of the Zherebets and Oskol rivers, putting them in a strong position to capture Kupiansk. If Volchansk, or rather when Volchansk falls, the Russians will also be in a strong position to sever Ukrainian transport links to Kupiansk, and the Russians will then be in a strong position to reverse, finally, all of the gains that the Ukrainians achieved over the course of their Kharkiv 22 counter-offensive, to recapture Liman, important town, west of the Zherebets River, close to Slavyansk, this key town, the key city, northern part of the Slavyansk Kramatorsk conurbation, to recapture, of course, Kupiansk itself, Izium, Balakleya, positioning themselves north of Slavyansk, in a position to attack Slavyansk from multiple directions. And further east, the Russians, I've said in many programs that they seem to be tightening the web that they're weaving around Siversk, town that they failed to capture in 2022, but it's definitely clear now that they are in the process of closing the ring around Siversk. A short time ago, they captured the important village of Razdolovka, up to the southwest of Siversk. They seem to be moving north now. There's reports that they've advanced into the next village as they move northwards towards Siversk as well. It looks as if Siversk is about to be attacked from multiple directions. The Russians have recaptured the villages of Belogorovka and Sporny, west of Siversk. Russian Defense Ministry has confirmed this. They've also captured the railway lines and are moving close now. Apparently they're at the very edge of Vimka, the village immediately south of Siversk. It's likely that in 2 or 3 weeks the Russians will have reached Siversk itself, that the battle for Siversk will begin in earnest. It's difficult to see how the Ukrainians can hold Siversk given the movement of Russian forces in all of these different directions, and of course the fact that the Ukrainians themselves are so heavily weakened in terms of their forces. It's difficult to see how the Ukrainians can hold Siversk for very long. And at that point, the Russians will have solid positions once they've captured ETHEREUM, Balakleya, Kupiansk, Ovolchansk, and Liman, which perhaps they will by late autumn, to launch an attack on Slavyansk, the northern spur of the Slavyansk Kramatorsk conurbation, the last major battle to clear Donbass. And further south, after the fall of the micro-district, west of the aqueduct, in the Chasov Yar area, we're now getting reports that the Russians have now begun the clearing operation in earnest south of Chasov Yar, the territory west of the, east of the aqueduct. They seem to have cleared most of the territory to the north of Chasov Yar along the eastern part of the aqueduct. They've seemed to have cleared all of that area fairly effectively. They're now doing the same apparently in the south. They've apparently in the process of capturing the various hills around Klashevka, which they recaptured some weeks ago. It looks like Ukrainian defences east of the aqueduct to the south of Chasov Yar are being dismantled, and the Russians will soon be in a position to attack Chasov Yar from the north and the south and the east. And also, once Klashevka and the area around it is fully consolidated, the Russians would also, incidentally, be in a position to advance from Klashevka in a southwestern direction towards Toretsk and to cut off the communications, the transport links to Toretsk from the north, from Konstantinovka and from Chasov Yar. And that is important because, of course, the battle for Toretsk continues to be underway. The Russians continue to push hard inside Toretsk itself. They have also increased their presence, apparently, in New York, this village, which is part of the Toretsk conurbation. The Russians are advancing deeper inside all of these places. There's been a significant amount of photographic and film evidence which shows the advance of the two Russian pincer movements inside Toretsk. And of course, if the Russians advance from Klashevka in the southwest direction, cut off the communications to the Toretsk, the Ukraine's Toretsk group from the north, well, that will massively complicate Ukrainian supply positions in the Toretsk direction. And of course, the situation will become completely catastrophic, potentially from the other direction, from the southwestern direction as well, because here we're getting reports that the Russians have now reached Vozdvizhenka from Novo-Alexandrovka. This is on the Ocheretino area. Vozdvizhenka lies on the road, or just south of the road, from Pokrovsk to Konstantinovka and Chasov Yar and Toretsk itself. And the Russians apparently are now literally outside Vozdvizhenka. They can easily see the buildings of Vozdvizhenka. If Vozdvizhenka falls,
the Russians would be able to cut the main road from Pokrovsk to Toretsk and in Chasiv Yar and Konstantinovka. So if the Russians push from Klishevka to cut the road leading from Konstantinovka to Toretsk, at the same time as they cut the road close to Vozvyzhenka leading from Pokrovsk to Toretsk, then all the supply lines to the Ukrainian grouping in Toretsk will in effect have been cut off. And the Ukrainians who are defending Toretsk could fairly quickly find themselves facing a supply crisis, and potentially they could find themselves in a cauldron, an actual serious cauldron there as well. So, a very, very difficult situation potentially for the Ukrainians in all of these places. And, well, I've already mentioned in the Avdiivka or Cheretino area that the Russians have now reached Vozvyzhenka. They have also apparently now reached positions within 500 meters of the village of Progress, which is part of the Pokrovsk conurbation, Pokrovsk being one of the main supply centers for the Ukrainian army in Donbass. The Russians have now, it is confirmed, indisputably broken into Novoselivka Persha, this other village in this area, major fortified position of the Ukrainian army. Apparently there's photographic evidence which shows the Russians in control of various buildings in Novoselivka Persha. This is a major defense point of the Ukrainian army in this area. If it's captured by the Russians, rather I should say when it's captured by the Russians, probably at some point within the next couple of days, then the Russians also advancing through another village, Karlovka. They're in a position also to move towards Selidovo, another one of the main Ukrainian defense positions. They're also in a position to move towards Kurakovo. We'll come to that in a moment. And once Progress falls, they can also push on towards Pokrovsk. Again, I think it is not well understood in the West, but the entire Ukrainian position, defenses in northern and central Donbass are coming close to the point of crisis, the point when it no longer becomes possible for the Ukrainians to defend their positions in north and central Donbass, including in the towns of Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, where the Ukrainians might be faced with the prospect of either withdrawing from those cities and perhaps withdrawing all the way to the west bank of the Dnieper River, or continuing to resist in those cities with the very real possibility in that case of having the Ukrainian forces that are still defending those cities completely cut off from hopes of resupply and finding themselves potentially encircled. Just saying. And, well, further south of this area of north-central Donbass, we're getting reports now that not only are the Russians on the brink of completing the capture of Krasnogorovka, important fortified town in itself, but one which opens the way for attacks in multiple directions on Kurakovo, another of the main supply cities that the Ukrainians rely upon, and the key supply city to maintain Ukrainian defenses in southern Donbass, in particular in the fortified town of Vuhledar. Anyway, not only does that potentially put Kurakovo in crisis, but it seems as if there is now a significant body of Ukrainian troops in Krasnogorovka who are actually physically trapped by the Russians. And the Ukrainians, in a rather desperate attempt to try to extricate these Ukrainian troops from Krasnogorovka, have launched a counterattack in southwestern Krasnogorovka. They've managed apparently to occupy a few buildings there. Nobody seriously expects that they will be able to hold them, but the idea seems to be to try to force the Russians to redeploy troops from northwestern Krasnogorovka to southwestern Krasnogorovka, so that those Ukrainian troops who are trapped in southwestern Krasnogorovka can somehow escape the encirclement that they now face. This Ukrainian counterattack in Krasnogorovka has about it a look of desperation, just as the Ukrainian counterattack into northern Volchansk across the Volcha River also has that look of desperation about it. In both cases, Volchansk and Krasnogorovka, it looks as if Ukrainian defenses are disintegrating finally. The battle for both of these towns has been prolonged beyond all reason. And just as happened a few months ago in Avdiivka, it looks like significant numbers of Ukrainian soldiers are cut off and might soon be taken prisoner. And, well, just to cap off this litany of disaster for Ukraine, a few days ago, the Russians confirmed the capture of Orozhaina. The Russian Defense Ministry confirmed that Orozhaina, the village in the Vremevka salient, which had been fought over so bitterly for so long, that has now indeed fallen under Russian control. So those two villages, Staromayorsk and Urozhaina, which were so often spoken about back in the day, last August, I remember, during the time of Ukraine's offensive, when the Ukrainians claimed to have captured those villages. It was a huge story in the Western media about the great success that the Ukrainian army had achieved. Like Rabotin a few weeks ago, the Russians have recaptured both of these villages, and the Western media is saying absolutely nothing about it. Now, we're getting reports from Ukrainian sources that Zelensky and his government are in a state of deep depression about the situation on the battlefronts, as they might be. Well, we don't have that confirmed, but we have had confirmation that one person, to be precise, Julian Repke, the reporter from Bild Zeitung, he's now come forward and he's made this post on Twitter X. And he's, of course, a fervid supporter of Ukraine. And he says this: if the Russian army is uneducated and untrained, using bikes instead of tanks, leaving behind their wounded, out of fresh water and starving, what does this say about the Ukrainian army losing almost every battle against the Russians since autumn 2023? And without bitter sarcasm, I'm so tired of all the cheap laughs about biking, piss drinking and ugly Russians. Either it's not representative at all for the real situation, or the Ukrainian army is in a comparable or even worse state. As a true friend of Ukraine, I'm worried about the future of the country. The current domestic and international policies in connection with the war are not leading to the deoccupation of the country. They're leading into the abyss.
And in fact, as I now remember, it was Bill Clinton that is saying that the government of Ukraine, Zelensky, Yermak, and all the others, are now in a state of complete depression. Well, leading in Ukraine into the abyss, does that remind you of what others have said? Does that remind you of Professor Mearsheimer all those years ago, warning about Ukraine being led down the primrose path? Do you remember all those programs that I've made, one after the other, worrying about the future of Ukraine? Well, that's Julian Repke. That is what he is now saying. Fervent supporter of Ukraine, as of course he is. Well, there we are. This is where I end my program today. Momentous events in the United States, important events in Ukraine itself. We'll see what the future holds, but this is where I end this very long program. More from me soon. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on Locals, X, other places. You can support our work via Premium and Premium and Subscribe Star, Patreon and Subscribe Star. Don't forget, of course, to check out our shop. Lots of great things there. And last but not least, if you've liked this program, please remember to tick the like button, check your subscription to this program. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.